Thank you guys so much for joining me today for this episode of Dynamo Chats. I have an amazing guest with me today. As you may know, he's the father of Dynamo, Ian Keough. He is now the CEO at Hypar. How are you doing, Ian?
Hi, Dana. Thank you very much. I told Dana before we started talking, I was like, I'm a little nervous. First of all, I haven't done a podcast in a while, and then on top of that, like this audience, you're the kind of community that you've built around this thing. I hope I don't screw up.
No, that's why I thought this would be such an amazing just chat for us to have, because I, of course, being Danamo, right? I have so many questions, and I'm so thankful for you for even agreeing to this, let alone everything you've done in your employment history, right? In your career. So maybe we could start a little bit by that, right? Like the father of Dynamo. What does that even mean? How are you kind of part of all of this, the creation of this, and really, what did you kind of foresee? I know that's a really loaded question, or multiple.
Yeah. So I mean, it's relatively simple. Way back in the day, and people who have followed me on social media and everything, know that I was actually trained as an architect, but I started kind of my career in practice not working in architecture at all. I went to work at Bureau Happold Consulting Engineers. And I worked there in New York for a little while, and then I moved to LA. And Dynamo actually started on one of the last projects that I started or that I worked on at Bureau Happold in Los Angeles. And it was this kind of crazy roof structure for HOK, this Anaheim Regional Intermodal Transport Center here in California, and it had this ETFE roof. And it was very complicated, the roof geometry. And the legend goes that HOK had gone to Autodesk and said, we're going to build this super complicated shape with this ETFE paneled roof and all this crazy steel and everything else. And we want to do it in Revit, because they were getting, that was still when firms were deciding, should we do BIM? Should we not do BIM? And Autodesk actually told them, please don't do that project in Revit. It's way too complicated. Well, it so happens that at Bureau Happold, we got the scope to do the facades package, which was all the complex bits. And I had already, for a couple of years at that point, been doing automations on top of Revit to build tools for Bureau Happold to build the kind of crazy stuff that Bureau Happold built. Bureau Happold built nutty buildings all over the world. We did a lot of stuff in the Middle East and just crazy geometry and stuff. And so I was starting to think about, how do I turn those tools into a thing that was more like explicit history, which your very astute listeners who are of a certain age also will remember that explicit history is what Rhino Grasshopper was called before it was Rhino Grasshopper. So I know you've had Asan on before. He probably knows the whole history. And so we kind of wanted something like that, but we wanted it so that the end result was in Revit instead of Rhino, because that's what HOK needed as well. So that's where the first version of Dynamo was born. And it was literally we thought, if we could just make it so that we could automate instances of families in Revit so that they could talk to each other and interact in a way, and adaptive components, I think, had just come on the scene. So there's this idea of if we could encode everything in adaptive components, there would be some smarts inside there. And then we could have these scripts that kind of made them attach to each other and respond to each other and everything else. And we could probably generate this whole building in that way. So it really came from this very simple premise of can we plug this parameter value or this measurement off this instance over here into this instance over here and just make systems in that way. That's where it started. So the very early versions, if you go to Twitter, actually also was just becoming a thing. So the first versions of Dynamo I put out on Twitter, with these kind of orange nodes. And then it went from there. And then by a weird set of circumstances, I got acquired for another thing that I built by this software company that got acquired by Autodesk, and then ended up inside Autodesk, where they were starting to see the value of something like Dynamo for automating Revit. And then we built a project team around it. And then I had the fantastic opportunity to work on that project for about, 4 or 5 years inside, turning Dynamo into the thing that you know today that's shipped in the box with Revit. Right.
That's amazing. And this was not even as an employee of Autodesk. This was working as a consultant for another firm.
Yeah. So I this was my nights and weekends project at Bureau Happold. And then some of the guys and some of the names that some of your listeners will also remember, like Zach Krohn, one of the original product managers of Dynamo, and Matt Jezik, who built the Dynamo team, reached out to me and said, hey, that thing you're working on and talking about on Twitter, can we start hacking on that as well? Because I think I had open sourced it at that point. And I was like, sure, if people inside Autodesk, I was like really tickled. People inside Autodesk want to like work on the thing that I was working on. And so they started to get some summer interns, a guy named Stephen Elliott from Northeastern University. They got him as a summer intern to come in and like rebuild the Dynamo engine for the first time. So like there was a really early version that I did, and then there was a version that Stephen did, and then we ended up building the design script engine later on. So yeah, they started contributing to it little by little. And it was that team that came to me once I was finally inside Autodesk and said, hey, you got to come and join us and we're going to like blow this thing up.
Which you did, right?
Yeah, although I should say, so just as a caveat to everybody who's listening, like the reason that we use the moniker the father of Dynamo is because I've been not involved in the Dynamo project for a very long time. And all of the success that's happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years of that has been through the continued sort of support of Autodesk, obviously, because a lot of people also don't know, like, it's still an open source project. Like Autodesk.
So it comes with the build now, right? I mean,
yes,
it comes inside.
It comes inside Revit, but you can go and get, with the exception of the geometry kernel, you can go and see the internals of like everything that is in Dynamo because it's just up on GitHub. And also the awesome team that Russell and others built around that project. And then also the contributions of the Revit team. Once it went inside the box with the Revit team, then you got things like the Dynamo player, so it just kind of scaled in a way that is kind of mind-blowing to me.
So that kind of brings us to what you're doing now, what you've been doing within the last 5, 7 years.
Yeah, so I left, so the brief history there is that in 2018, I left Autodesk. And at the time I was working in what was called the generative design team. I don't know if it's still called the thing, but it was the generative design for AEC team. And myself and Anthony Keough, who is my co-founder at Hypar, we were working on things like Project Fractal. Project Fractal was the beginnings of generative design powered by Dynamo, the ability to take your Dynamo script, turn it into a kind of a generative engine. And we actually built a fully web-based version of that thing so that you could publish your Dynamo scripts, run them in this engine, do things like optimizers and stuff like that, and see your parallel coordinates chart. And so there's a lot of this stuff on the internet. You can go back and find it all. The stuff that would eventually become generative design, I think it's called generative design for Revit now. But we kind of saw that there was an opportunity to scale past what we were doing with Dynamo. AWS at the time was starting to think about things like functions as a service. That is, like, you just push some compute to one of these cloud providers and they scale that thing to whatever size you want. And so a lot of the limitations of Dynamo would be overcome by building a system that fundamentally allowed you to run this stuff at cloud scale. And so we started to think, what would like a distributed compute system for AEC with a super simplified interface look like? That was the original premise. And then where we're thinking about kind of building systems, what does it take to push the generative logic for a structural system for a building into the cloud and then make it so that you could interact with it. So the cloud-based sort of compute engine was one part of it, but then there was the application itself. The challenge and bringing users back to like why this, the conversation we're having today, and I don't know if you're going to title it this when you put this out, but the conversation, I said, I want to talk about building your own BIM. The reason for that is because Dynamo, much like Grasshopper, much like a lot of these things, is a plugin to another application. It rides on top of another application. So when we started building Hypar, we started to think about, can we build an application where you have the ability to extend it, but everything that you create acts as like a first-class citizen in the application. You're not riding on top of an application trying to reach in and make it do things that it doesn't want to do, which we did a lot with Dynamo. The fact that some of that stuff even works, like you can control elements and could we make an application where you had the level of extensibility where you could build anything, but you could also kind of expose that as native elements in the application? And I will give a big shout out to Zach Krohn, again, the early product manager of Dynamo, who got me thinking about this. And I think about Zach all the time when he said, what if we built a software with no buttons? Like even before Dynamo Player was a thing, even before Design Script, even before anything in Dynamo, he had this idea that you could have this application which was just a core, and you could use things like Dynamo scripts to define capabilities that people could bring in and add to that thing so that they could build their own kind of application that was just very specific to the thing that they wanted to do. And it wasn't like this thing with 10,000 things that you don't want to touch and one thing that you do. So that's been also kind of hanging in the back of my head for a really long time.
But I guess it really comes down to the interface, right? That you're attempting to provide and what you're putting people inside of it and interfacing with,
yep.
Right? Like ultimately.
Yep. So we did think one of the things that is a challenge, and your audience will probably all roll their eyes and agree when I say this, is the challenge with Dynamo scripts is that they can get very big and very ungainly very quickly.
Yeah, we were joking, you and I have a Dynamo Shorts episode line where they're 30 minutes long. You know
right.
what I mean? Even just to explain a basic concept does take time. It's a lot.
Yep. And also just like those scripts. So we started to experiment with things with modularization. Can we take a script and turn it into a node and use that node in other scripts, or even do things people who have been following Dynamo for a long time remember that you could take a script and turn it into a node and embed that node inside itself and get recursive behavior, which blew people's minds. But that idea of modularity so that scripts wouldn't end up being these enormous 500 node sort of monstrosities. So they don't scale very well. And one thing that we noticed when we started Hypar is that the tooling for all of software development and the rest of the industry, not in our little cul-de-sac of AEC, was developing really amazing package management systems and code development tools and code collaboration tools and code checking tools and all these things that were meant to make packaging up your code into reusable modular libraries easier and easier. So we started to think could we make systems on Hypar that could be as small as possible and do one thing really, really well, and then make Hypar the system where you orchestrate those things together. And so one way at a high level to think about Hypar is imagine your Dynamo scripts, but your Dynamo script might do something as simple as draw one floor's worth of beams. It's the girder layout tool that only draws the beams on the grid, the primary grid intersections. That's all it's responsible for. And then it negotiates with a column drawing algorithm that draws the vertical parts of the structural system. And it negotiates with a brace drawing system that is only responsible for drawing the braces of the structural system. And by doing that, you can make these things that are really, really small and really, really succinct. And then the challenge is how do you visualize the orchestration between those things? And I can show some stuff too. You want to see some stuff?
I would love to see some stuff.
Let's actually let's go to Hypar as it is today. So I'm also gonna in showing this, I'm also gonna give you a little sneak peek into what we're building today. And so your audience will have a little taste of what's coming up. But what you're gonna see for the first part of this is Hypar 1.0, where we're calling it Hypar 1.0. So starting in 2018, 2019, we started to build Hypar. If you were to go to hypar.io today, this is more or less what you'd see. And so I was just talking about the ability to make these individual functions that represent sort of systems in the thing. You'll note that there's no visual programming at all. So although each of these things here is a system, you don't have to say this thing connects to this other thing. The system takes care of that for you. So that stuff is happening behind the scenes. We're orchestrating the connection between all these systems, but you don't have to wire things up in that way. There's a kind of a way that a function declares, I need some slabs. And another function says, I make slabs. So once I've made my slabs, you get to use my slabs. And that talks a little bit about elements, and I'll get to elements in a second. But, you know, those of you who have used, let me try and find a function that actually has some, those of you who have used like the player are probably really familiar with this kind of interface. Like the simplification was take all the stuff that's at that left side of your Dynamo graph, the inputs, and like turn it into just a panel of inputs. But as soon as we built this, we thought to ourselves, man, there's going to be a lot of time spent like over here in sliders and in drop downs and in when the model is over here. Like the thing people want to like interact with is actually over here in 3D space. So all for a few years while we were building this version of the platform, we were thinking, how do we get more and more of this stuff off of these places over here and into the building itself? So this is basically a Hypar workflow. You know, behind the scenes in the cloud, it's spinning up whatever functions it needs to build a structure, lay out equipment in rooms, do space planning, and all these things. And over the time that we were doing that, we started to move more and more of the core interactions out of these kinds of panels here into the kind of elements themselves. So, you know, this is a BIM, if you will, because it's actually generating BIM elements. But those things have modes that you can kind of put them in order to do the things that are germane to whatever you need to do. So in space planning here, there's a space planning module. When you double click into this thing, it puts you into a mode where you can actually like do space planning. And every time you kind of like save out of that mode, it's going and telling the workflow, okay, we've saved some bit of this thing. Go and execute everything that's downstream of this thing and reconcile all that. And what these functions do is they create elements. So elements are actually core since the very beginning of Hypar and probably even before that to the idea of Hypar. And we started thinking about this in Dynamo. You know, if you've ever had a graph and you're creating all this data in these kind of like tree structures and you think, man, everything inside those tree structures represents individual objects that I care about with properties. I think there was a time when we were trying to objectify things in Dynamo. We had some objectification nodes, which were meant to turn things into these data objects. Well, Hypar kind of starts there. Like everything is an element, and you as a builder in the system can define your own elements. You can say, I want a new foo, and that foo has these properties. And that foo then becomes a first-class citizen when a function creates it, manifests it, puts it in the model. It's as good as anything else that's in the model. That is to say, like in Revit, you know, there's the things that are built into Revit, and then there are things that you build on top of it. But you don't have a kind of a level of access down into the sort of native things. In Hypar, you have a level of access down into kind of everything. So these beams here, these things are actually defined in a schema in Hypar someplace that defines the element type for a beam. So this is kind of Hypar 1.0, you know, but we got to a point with this where we were like, you know, still too much has to happen over here in this panel. It's still too complicated. The interface is still too expert. This is Dana's interface. Like you could get in here and like really make some wicked stuff. Like you'd know how to set this whole thing up. You'd know how to build workflows and everything else. But as we started to build more of these workflows like space planning and stuff, we thought we started to get a lot of feedback from users who were like, this really needs to be easier. Can you make this even easier? Don't make me think about functions or systems or anything else. How easy can this get? So this is Hypar 2.0. So you'll note that it's almost like there's nothing here. And this is
blank
kind
canvas.
It's a kind of a blank canvas, which is a little funny because we have a saying inside Hypar that you should never start from a blank sheet. But we're kind of purposefully starting people from a blank sheet here for a reason, because the thing that we wanted in this interface was we wanted the first interactions to be super easy to find and use and super fun. And so, you know, when I was talking about elements, everything that's down in this little add toolbar down here and all of this stuff, these are all elements. You're not going to think about systems anymore. You're not going to think about having to wire up even that stack of functions. You're not going to think about any of that stuff. what you're going to think about is like, what's the element that I want to place in the scene, in the BIM, and how do I want to interact with that thing as if it were a thing in the real world? And it would still have all the stuff that you saw a moment ago running behind the scenes. That stuff is all still there, and the capability is still there. But it's orchestrating almost completely transparent to the user. What the user will experience is something that just feels like a modeling application. And so just to give you an example, like if you want to place a space, you click on this thing and you place a space. That's it. So now the concept of a space is actually an element. There's a space type that's called an element. Now there's other systems in here, like we saw in the last example, doing things like program requirements and stuff. So you start to see things coming up over here where you can define like, well, I need 5 of these spaces and they each need to be, 120 square foot or whatever. So this is calculating your metrics in real time. But when you want to think about like how these elements become generative, if I were to take this space and change it into something else, that's when it actually executes the logic for laying out a space and gives you a new configuration. So somewhere in the cloud, a service spun up that has some generative logic for meeting rooms in it. And it executed for this one configuration of a meeting room, and then it probably shut down. If I do a lot of these, it'll stay running and it'll process all those requests. But you see that it develops a novel configuration every time I drop one of these things in here. So you get this kind of like direct interaction with a thing that is a thing that you as an architect or a builder understands. It's an element that represents a space, that represents a meeting room. We're not using fancy language here, talking about scripts and functions and systems and everything else. It's just stuff that you know. And the interactions are super fast, and all of the interactivity happens down at the level of the thing. If I want to satisfy my program over here that needs 5 of these things, I can just go and drag out, 5 of these things, boom, 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 in my building. And it'll tell me, bang. Well, now I'm actually over because I made 6 of them, So the interaction should be, where possible, the interaction should be on the element itself. You should have the ability to do things like, I want to lock this thing to be 200 square feet so that if I change it, it always stays 200 square feet, but it adjusts in one dimension. I probably created an invalid room, but, so interaction first with elements. Meanwhile, all of this stuff is BIM. You can take this thing and press, we have a little add-in, you can go in Revit, you can say import from a project, and Hypar gives you a list of projects. And all of this stuff actually is associated with family instances in Revit, and it'll bring in native Revit assets. So you don't get some junky thing. You get like actual walls, actual spaces, actual room tags. You get actual furniture, like just placed correctly. So it's a way to get to your BIM like 1,000 times faster. One last thing I'll show, and just to give you a kind of sense of like how the systems that I was talking about before are running under the hood here. What will happen in Hypar 2.0 is that there are some types of like sneaky kind of things almost that we're going to do that are powered by that platform. And so like if you have a building element in your model, you can create this building element and you can say, I want to make this building, 3 stories tall. Right, so it's super easy to just make this building element. Then you can do things like put a grid line in here, and let's put another grid line in here. And let's take this guy and rotate him. Now you have 2 grid lines that cross inside a building. You'll see that even before I place that grid line, it placed a column. Now, what's happening is that under the hood, there's a structural function executing again in the cloud that says, I found an intersection of these 2 things called grid lines. I'm going to execute because I'm the column function, and I'm going to put in a column. And this will happen for as many of these things as you put in, as many intersections as there are. And if you change the height of the building, it'll say, okay, the building envelope in which I'm operating has a couple of new floors, so I should re-execute and actually extend up through those floors. And the user didn't actually have to say, I want columns. They said, I put a building and I put some grid lines in that building, and now the columns just kind of appeared. So there's going to be more and more of these kinds of natural interactions for architects and planners that are just giving them the affordance of doing the things that they'll already do in their planning, but all powered by this compute platform that kind of encodes a lot of our expertise about how these things get laid out in the world. So that's a lot. I talked a lot.
I feel like I should be writing down my questions as they're coming about, because there's so many that are automatically popping into my head. And I guess one of the first things would be, it seemed like you could create new functions to create new logic, right? So if I wanted to, do additional things at a column grid line, I could potentially do those things, right? You're essentially just creating a front end to generate those types of what you're referring to as functions, or really just the logic behind the task that's occurring.
You're exactly right. And if anybody in your audience has tried to write a function for Hypar 1.0, there's a couple things that you do. One thing that you do is you say, here are the types of elements that I want to build with that function. And here's the logic that function is going to use to build that element. So you publish both of those things to Hypar, and then it knows about your element type, and it knows the logic that needs to execute when something happens in the scene. So we don't have it exposed yet in Hypar 2.0, which, by the way, this is all in beta right now. So nobody has access to this except people who are beta testing. But what will happen is in the future, whereas in Hypar 1.0, when you built a function, you drop that function into the scene. In Hypar 2.0, you'll add an element type here. Your custom element type will show up in the add toolbar, and the functions that are required to generate that element type will be automatically added in the background, so that you as a user, you don't have to think, oh, I got to add this function that creates columns or beams or whatever. You'll just say, no, I want the beam thing in my project. And then again, your interaction will be all through those elements.
It's amazing. And as the viewers might be familiar, I wouldn't have to go in and select the category and select all elements of the category and get the types and do all of the things behind the scenes. You're creating a much easier interface for users to come in here and in a very nimble way be able to generate elements based off of logic.
Yeah, we're really, really pushing the envelope to see how minimal we can make the interface for you to express custom logic as well. So some of you might have seen, we've been doing experiments with kind of AI-based stuff for a long time. We did a thing called text to BIM a while back that you can go on YouTube and find text to BIM. Starting to play with some of these newer, for instance, AI technologies and things like large language models. Can we get down to the place where instead of anybody even having to write code, we could write code for them from a textual description? I want to provide custom logic for how to lay out a room. Can I, using human language, just describe the content that I want in that room and the layout, and then have our backend code written in elements and everything else generated automatically, compiled, and running on Hypar, so that anybody now can do this? Because one of the other things that we started to recognize about Dynamo is that people like yourselves who are experts have that skill now inside firms, and other people are like, well, I've got Dana, she'll figure all this stuff out for me and she'll give me the tools, and they're not empowered themselves to build the tools. Even as much as Dynamo tried to be a super easy interface, people still look at that and they're like, nodes, wires, I don't know, and I've got Dana, so I don't worry about it. But like, these technologies are unlocking new interfaces, which are going to provide a level of abstraction that's super comfortable for people to just say, like, make sure that my meeting room table is in the center of the room. It's always surrounded by 8 chairs if it's this big, or 4 chairs if it's this big. Put a whiteboard on one end of the room and a bookshelf along the northern wall.
Well, and I guess that would lead me to my next question is, where does that logic, where the cloud is computing and generating all of this information, where does that come from? And can I be the source of it? Can my old projects be the source of it?
So the old project things is super interesting because everybody is interested in this. As soon as we show them this kind of like dynamic room stuff, they're like, wait, so can I take my old projects and somehow sort of upgrade them or use them in this way. And what I'll say is that there's a couple of different ways that this kind of content becomes existing on Hypar. One of them is just taking stuff out of projects that you've created before. So if you do get access to the beta, one of the things you'll see is that there's some stuff that's already built in here. And a lot of this stuff is around healthcare because we're doing a big push with healthcare planners right now.
The hardest thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, but it's
start
super
with the hardest,
important.
and
it's super hard and
easy,
super complicated,
right?
and you know, because you're involved in this as well, right? So like we figured, look, if we can make this thing work for healthcare, we can make it work kind of anywhere. And so we actually took advantage of some of the VA specs that they built into BIM a long time ago, and we took those Revit models, and we actually have a way to pull out all the existing rooms and turn those into template rooms in the application. So, you know, you can bring in an exam room and put that in here. And it's actually bringing in actual content from the actual VA model that was in the, and then for some of these room types, I don't know if this one has it, but for some of these room types, there's also variants. So like, let me bring in a standard meeting room here. If I spell it correctly, we bring in a meeting room. Some of these also have variants, so you can switch between. You can say, and the way you do that is in this export mechanism from Revit. You can actually line up a bunch of these rooms, varied by type or varied by size. Export them all at one go, and it will batch them all into one set of variants for that room type. Because the case for this is that typically there's an exam room type in a healthcare situation where it's some subdivision of the structural grid. It's a 12-foot room on a 24-foot grid, so there could be 2 in between column lines, as an example. Well, the 12-foot version of that room and the 12-foot 6-inch version of that room actually get laid out differently. The content gets laid out differently. So you can lay these things out in Revit using the skills you already have, and then push these things down, and they show up as these kind of, you know, drop-down lists of variants. That's like static content. If you want the content to become dynamic, then you actually have to write some code. So like, you know, if I put in an open office and I, you know, just drop this guy in here and I start, and this is one of our oldest kind of dynamic space planning functions because Andrew Human's been working on this since we started doing space planning for offices a long time ago. There's actually logic that somebody has published to Hypar, which is like the open office desk layout function. So you would have to write some code, or in the future, maybe not, you don't have to write code, but you get code compiled for you from a description. Push that stuff to Hypar, and then say, every time an open office room appears in my scene, execute this logic. But again, the system takes care of most of that for you.
That's fantastic. And at some point, you mentioned it, right? These all equate to some sort of Revit element or Revit family type. So at some point, it does become an interoperability workflow, right? Like we're going for documentation purposes, if nothing else.
I would love to say that Hypar 2.0 is going to replace Revit from your workflow, but it's not. What it's going to do is it's going to be the springboard to getting to your BIM 100, 200, 300% faster. You know, the challenge for anybody who's done space planning in Revit is that it's just not built for doing that. You know, it's built for cutting plans and sections of fully modeled things. And I mean, I've seen your workflows for dropping in from a program requirements document, like all the types that people need to build from. That interaction is like so complicated, involves Dynamo scripts and the player running.
And they're not very easy Dynamo scripts to manage.
And they're not very easy Dynamo scripts to manage, right? So like we feel like there's so much at the front end of the feasibility, concept, schematic, even into early DD process around planning and building your BIM that could be in part automated with a fallback to just being able to treat this like any kind of BIM application and edit things as you want to edit them.
Well, and it's interesting earlier, and I must commend you, being the father of Dynamo, that Smith Group, most of the time we're utilizing Rhino or some other geometry friendly and nimble software to form these, crazy forms that you're seeing. It once again becomes an interoperability workflow of how do generating those adaptive components or what have you that then we've made logic from in this more nimble program, right? It becomes this situation of we're doing a lot early on in a program that makes the most sense, whatever that is, and at some point translating over. And I would say that this is almost exactly that, right? We're taking space planning into a circumstance where it's much more nimble, it's much more user friendly. The functions, as you're calling them, are already set up and the logic is there for me to utilize. And then when I need to, push it back into Revit.
Yeah, and I will say, I think you're calling out sort of geometry as one of these things. Man, that is one thing that we've been thinking about from the beginning. Like, we have Andrew Human on our team, who's obviously one of the leading lights in the Rhino Grasshopper community. Super, super facile with writing, Rhino code that can do anything for you. And we've had to really be careful over the years of developing Hypar to not fall down the trap that I think a lot of architectural workflows have fallen into, to think like we need to solve all the geometric problems. If Zaha Hadid's office can't build their building with my software is no good. I mean, the fact is, and I don't want to limit what people's expectations for Hypar should be, because your expectations for Hypar should be limitless. But like, the fact is that 99% of all the buildings out there are not those buildings. And so, when we're working with customers on very large healthcare facilities, they might have one facade that's curved because it's a signature part of the architecture, and we will need to work to make it so that the layout along those facades is like adaptive, and they spend the least amount of time as possible like jiggling boxes around, as they like to say. But certainly we shouldn't start from the place where we have to support all of that geometry and everything else. But yes, if you are a firm that uses Rhino for conceptual design, we have to be able to have the ability to like bring in your core and shell and then provide that interface for people to be planning into. Because the other thing about all of this is that design is done in teams, right? Like our planners who are planning in Hypar 2.0 and are starting, they're like, how do I collaborate with my teammates who are doing core and shell design in Revit? And to them, we just say, well, start by sharing. Just share this workflow with your collaborators, let them get in here, and ultimately we're going to bring in their Revit context as well. So as they're updating their context, their context is visible in here, and you can plan up against it. And then ultimately they can pull your changes down into their Revit as well, so they can see your fully modeled out plan. So yeah, the aspect of like sharing and collaboration and how the web unlocks that's a whole other conversation.
Well, once again, I must commend you. If you're the father of Dynamo, I'm one of your children, and as Danamo, right?
Oh my gosh.
And so, being that I am, 100% pushing Dynamo and how to kind of sit on top of Revit and use Revit in a smarter way, as you've seen. Building something completely outside of Revit just seems like almost an impossible feat. So hats off to you.
Well, thank you. But I will say, like, all of this is an evolution. We think every day here we are talking about as a team, not just about, the intricacies of building a piece of software. We're talking about what is the next thing the industry needs. The industry adopting Revit as it was back in the day kind of needed Dynamo, kind of needed an automation solution that was for the everyman. Like,
well, and to get them into this way of thinking, right? To kind of evolve them into this computational space of at least knowing that it's possible, right? That even if they do have a Dana at their firm, that going behind the scenes and having this godlike hand and doing these types of things is possible.
Yeah, exactly. Not feeling constrained by your tool.
Exactly.
And so now I just think that this is an evolution of that. We're constantly thinking about how do we do it better? How do we make it easier? Because I think the next generation of people who are coming up, like everybody who's using Dynamo now and on top of Revit and is probably 15 years into their career, 10, 15 years into their career, like they're okay with it because they came up through it. They have no different But like I have a 15-year-old daughter, and like I'm trying to think if she were to ever go into architecture, like she would look at these tools like, what are these things? Like I grew up on Minecraft and Roblox and Fortnite and social collaborative
Yeah, Fisher
content
Price taught
creation
me to
platforms.
code.
You know, like she's not gonna, how difficult these things are is just not gonna compute for her at all. So constantly
Exactly.
thinking about the next generation, how we make these things easier and more accessible.
Well, and I think that you're doing exactly that, and in trying to reshape how we think about how we're working with BIM, right? Building a better BIM, building our own
Yeah.
BIM.
Yeah. And who knows? It might not be that everybody, look, I don't suffer from the delusion that I think everybody should build their own software. That's not what I mean to suggest, but I do think increasing agency to people who right now don't feel like they're part of the group that's in the know either is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, and for people like me that build those types of tools to try to get people to automate their BIM at the very least, we can surely be sympathetic to the fact that not your everyday architect is going to be your next Ian.
And this is why, Dana, this is why I'm having this conversation, because right after this, I'm going to ask you, like, hey, you want to build a Hypar function? You want to get in there and build a system on Hypar?
Right.
We'd love to have you build something.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Ian. I always appreciate a good conversation. Of course, thank you for coming on to DanamoBIM.
Thank you so much for having me. It was awesome.
Need help with Dynamo workflows you've seen on DanamoBIM or any other Dynamo training or assistance? Our sponsor, BIMXT Network, has you covered. Send an email with your request as well as your contact information to info@cadmicrosystems.com. In addition, BIMXT Network holds meetings to bring together bright, curious, engaging people across various disciplines and countries to exchange design and construction technology ideas. BIMXT Network hosts presentations virtually through the online platform as well as in person at locations along the East Coast. For information about the BIMXT Network, please make sure you go to LinkedIn and search for the BIMXT Network group. By joining this group, you'll get information about upcoming meetings, information about previous meetings, including links to the recordings of those meetings, as well as any information about meetings that could be happening near you.